The night air in rural Georgia, 1854, carried a heaviness that clung to the lungs like dust off the red clay roads. Moonlight spilled across the horizon, touching the rows of cotton, and the silhouettes of men and women bent under its weight. The sound of the cicadas rose and fell like a chant, and from a distance, the steady crack of a whip echoed once then again, and then silence. It was in that silence that the voice of Elijah more found its strength, deep, commanding, twisted in faith and power. He stood on the front porch of his plantation house, a tall figure painted in ivory light, the Bible resting on his palm. Every night, before the final candle burned out, he read from the same passage, whispering of salvation, redemption, and the forgiveness of sin. But the irony hung thick in the air, for Elijah's voice carried to those kneeling in the dust below, the very souls he kept shackled by day. It had been 22 years since he inherited the land outside Macon. The Moore plantation was one of the largest in the region, its cotton stretching beyond the tree line, its people numbered like property in ledgers locked inside the smoky office by the parlor. Elijah Moore, a man known throughout the county for his sermons, was spoken of with reverence by some and disgust by others. He preached on Sundays at the White Chapel in town, his words flowing like honey about God's grace and eternal judgment. Yet at home, his sermons turned into whispers over bruises and cries swallowed by darkness. Tonight, the preacher-slave master would perform his ritual. He called it the midnight gospel, a practice that had no place in any church, but one that Elijah believed cleansed his soul. The workers gathered unwillingly near the old oak tree, the one split by lightning the year before. Its charred bark smelled of rain even on clear nights. Elijah's overseer, Thomas Clay, herded them into a loose circle, his face expressionless, his hands wrapped tightly around a lantern. Elijah stepped forward, reciting his verse, Corinthians, always Corinthians, about the wages of sin and the need for repentance. But it was not his sin he aimed to wash away that night. Not yet. The first screams began softly, muffled, more air than sound. The lantern flickered, revealing Elijah's eyes, not crazed, not wild, but focused, calm, convinced. He was cleansing his land, he told himself, cleansing it in blood. Yet afterward, when the people were sent back to their quarters and silence fell, he would return to his study, light another candle, and pray for forgiveness until dawn. That was Elijah Moore's cycle. Sin, salvation, suppression, repeat. What no one knew, not his young wife, not Clay, not the pastor in Macon who called him Brother Moore, was that Elijah believed he heard God's voice. It came not in thunder or visions, but in moments of stillness, whispering just loud enough to shape every violent sermon and every misguided act of devotion. That year, 1854, Georgia sweltered through a record heat wave. Crops burned before they ripened, wells turned shallow, and tempers flared even among the devout. Rumors swept through the county that a plague was coming, not disease, but a curse of conscience. Some said it would begin with the men who preached one gospel and lived another. The whispers reached even the quarters. The slaves spoke of signs, birds falling dead from the rafters, fireflies circling the same spots for hours, and a preacher whose prayers sounded too much like punishments. One morning, as the sun lifted through haze, Elijah watched the field hands from his porch, a silver cup of bourbon in hand. His wife, Annabelle, barely 23, stood beside him with arms crossed over her nightgown. She had not spoken much since spring. "You don't sleep anymore," she said quietly. "Even when you do, you wake shouting scripture." Elijah's gaze stayed on the horizon. "I hear him clearer at night," he muttered. "You wouldn't understand." "I understand enough," she whispered. "Enough to know God doesn't speak through blood." Her words lingered like a sting, but Elijah didn't reply. Instead, he turned and walked inside, pacing until the floorboards creaked beneath his boots. His obsession had grown, festering like rot inside his chest. That evening, beneath a sinking sky bruised purple, a stranger arrived. A man on horseback, dressed in gray, carrying nothing but a leather Bible strapped to his saddle. He claimed to be a circuit preacher from Savannah, come to spread the Lord's message to the far plantations. Elijah welcomed him with the charm that had fooled so many before, the warm handshake, the polite smile, the practiced humility. "Stay the night," Elijah said. "The Lord surely sent you." But as the two men sat over supper, the conversation shifted from polite to probing. "You've got quite the reputation," the preacher said, spoon clinking against his bowl. "They say your sermons bring the whole town to tears." Elijah smiled faintly. "Tears are a mark of conviction." "Or guilt," the man replied. Outside, lightning flashed across the fields, silent and distant. The conversation teetered between civility and something else, suspicion, recognition. The preacher's eyes searched Elijah's, as if measuring the distance between holiness and hypocrisy. By the time they rose from the table, the air had turned heavy with rain and something unspoken. That night would mark the first crack in Elijah Moore's armor, the moment he realized that even the most righteous man's voice trembles when his lies begin to echo back at him. As the stranger knelt to pray before sleep, Elijah lingered by the doorway, watching him, questioning his purpose. His hand twitched toward the revolver on the mantel, then hesitated. For the first time in years, doubt had weight in his bones. Out in the slave quarters, whispered prayers rose softly into the night. Someone had told them about the visitor, a man of God not from their master's bloodline. Hope flickered in the darkness, fragile but real, spreading like the first firefly of summer. Beneath the cross that stood crooked in the yard, Elijah Moore walked alone, rain washing over his shoulders, his Bible clutched tight as if it might burst into flame. He looked up at the sky and murmured, "Give me a sign, Lord." The thunder answered. And as dawn broke, for the first time in years, Elijah Moore didn't go to the fields. He stayed in his study instead, staring at his reflection in the glass, a man losing faith in himself, and maybe in the voice he thought was divine. The next morning began with the metallic hum of cicadas and the faint scent of tobacco from the workers' pipes. The field shimmered with dew, each stalk of cotton bending under its own weight, as if in prayer. From the big house, Annabelle watched through the parlor window while the stranger, Reverend Samuel Carter, helped himself to a bowl of grits at the long dining table. He carried himself differently than most traveling preachers, less like a man selling God and more like one quietly chasing him. His voice was calm, deliberate, sprinkled with a tinge of sorrow whenever he spoke. "Elijah," Samuel said, glancing toward the window, "your land is blessed. But blessing comes with burden." Elijah's hand paused over his coffee. "You sound like a man who already knows my burdens." Samuel smiled, though his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "I've seen men like you before, pillars of faith, loved by their parish, respected by their neighbors, outwardly saved, inwardly starving." Annabelle stiffened at the words, expecting Elijah's temper to surge, but he only lowered his gaze to the cup, his reflection trembling in the dark liquid. "You think I'm starving, Reverend?" "I think you've mistaken guilt for grace," Samuel replied. The silence stretched across the table, a fragile tension held together by manners. Annabelle excused herself quietly, the echo of her footsteps fading down the hall. Elijah rose slowly and walked toward the door. "Come," he said. "Let me show you the land you think you understand." The two men rode in silence through the plantation. The morning heat climbed fast, drawing a shimmer from the earth. Men and women worked under the whip of Thomas Clay, their backs slick with sweat, their eyes hollow, but alert. Always alert. Samuel watched closely, but said nothing. Only when they stopped by the old oak did he speak. "That tree," Samuel said softly, "it looks burned." "It was struck by lightning last year," Elijah replied. "Splintered straight down the middle. Some say that's where the Lord struck the devil." Samuel looked at him, his brow furrowed. "And which one lived?" The question hung there, simple but heavy. Elijah turned away, his jaw clenched tight. "You talk big for a guest in another man's home." "I talk truth," Samuel said, dismounting. "The air here feels like it's trapped between confession and curse." Elijah didn't answer. The stranger's words burrowed deep, unsettling parts of him he'd buried years ago, childhood shame, his father's voice, the beatings disguised as lessons about obedience and honor. He had learned early that fear dressed itself as discipline. Now, decades later, Elijah wielded that same weapon without thinking. That evening, the tension thickened like smoke. Annabelle lit candles in the chapel room, her hands trembling only when no one was watching. She'd felt an unshakable dread since Samuel's arrival, as if the stranger could see through the walls into every hidden bruise this house had caused. After dinner, Samuel asked if he might lead them in prayer. "Perhaps," he said, "a different kind of sermon tonight. One for peace." Elijah hesitated but nodded, curious to test the man's words against his own doctrine. The small group gathered in the parlor: Annabelle, Elijah, two field hands chosen to serve indoors, and Clay, who leaned against the wall, chewing his pipe in skepticism. Samuel began softly, his voice traveling through the flicker of candlelight. "Lord," he said, "we ask not for the power to command others, but for the humility to understand them. We ask not to be cleansed of our sins in secret, but to face them in truth before the eyes of those we've wronged." Annabelle closed her eyes. The servants shifted, uneasy but attentive. Elijah's knuckles whitened around his Bible. No man had ever dared to say words like that under his roof, not in front of his slaves, not in front of Clay. Samuel continued, "There is no salvation in silence, no redemption in chains." The final line cracked through Elijah like a strike of lightning. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floorboards. "That's enough." Samuel opened his eyes, calm and deliberate. "Is it the prayer you object to, or the mirror it holds?" Elijah's voice dropped low. "You forget yourself. These people serve because the Lord ordered it so. Or because you did," Samuel said quietly. The room froze. Clay's hand twitched toward his belt, but Elijah lifted a hand to stop him. "You will leave this house in the morning," he said through tight lips. "Tonight, you'll remember whose land you stand on." Samuel nodded without protest. "If it were your land, Mr. Moore, maybe God wouldn't be so restless upon it." Later that night, thunder rolled again across the horizon, echoing the tension that had no place to go. Elijah sat alone in his study with the Bible cracked open beside a full glass of bourbon. His mind replayed the day's words, each one cutting deeper than the next. No redemption in chains. The phrase looped until it merged with his pulse. He looked toward the window, where rain struck in thin streaks, and beyond, he thought he saw movement by the quarters, a shadow passing between lantern lights. He rose, gun in hand, stepping out into the storm. The mud clung to his boots as he moved toward the cabins. The door to one stood slightly open, light spilling through the crack. Inside, voices murmured, one of prayer, one of comfort. Elijah froze when he caught the rhythm of Samuel's baritone. The stranger was not alone. Several workers knelt around him, listening with wide, tearful eyes. Samuel wasn't preaching the gospel Elijah had built his empire on. He spoke of freedom as faith, of worth that no man could claim to own. Elijah felt something primal tighten in his stomach, not anger, but fear. Fear that the voice he'd built his life on wasn't God's at all, but his own. Lightning flashed, lighting Elijah's face at the doorway. Samuel turned and met his eyes, unflinching. "You shouldn't be here," Elijah hissed. "Neither should they," Samuel answered, gesturing softly at the kneeling workers. "Yet here we all are, in the same room where truth finally breathes." Elijah's hand trembled on the revolver. The rain drowned the silence, filling every gap between heartbeats. For a moment, he thought of Annabelle, her warning, her sadness, her quiet faith that forgiveness meant change, not control. He lowered the gun, eyes burning, and whispered, "You'll be gone by sunrise." Samuel nodded, his voice barely audible. "Then so will your sleep." For the rest of that night, Elijah sat on his porch, the storm thinning overhead, the world wet and new again, but his soul heavy as ever. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of whispered hymns carried through the drizzle, not his prayers, not his words, but ones that no longer belonged to him. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the soil thick and sweet with the scent of decay. The world always looked cleaner after rain, but Elijah Moore felt none of that renewal. He hadn't slept. His mind circled the same words again and again. No redemption in chains. They echoed louder than any verse he had ever preached, and they refused to fade. When Samuel Carter came down from the guest quarters, the morning light cut across his face, serene and untroubled. He greeted Annabel in the hall, thanking her for the hospitality, his tone gentle, almost sorrowful. "I'll be leaving after breakfast," he told her. She nodded politely, her eyes betraying a quiet grief. Elijah sat at the far end of the dining table, his plate untouched. "You've said your piece," he muttered, voice rough from bourbon and anger. "Now you can ride back to Savannah and tell your congregation whatever ghost story you please." Samuel smiled faintly, pouring himself a cup of black coffee. "I won't tell stories, Elijah. I'll tell truths. Whether they haunt you or free you, that's not mine to decide." Annabel glanced between them, her fingers tightening around her rosary. She knew there was no winning this conversation. One man worshiped control, the other conviction. "You both speak as if God is listening," she said softly. "Maybe he's waiting for one of you to stop talking long enough to hear him." Silence took the room. Then Samuel rose from the table, gathering his Bible. He looked at Elijah one last time. "One day you'll kneel for mercy, not command it. When that day comes, may the Lord's silence not be louder than his voice." Elijah didn't reply. He watched as the stranger mounted his horse and rode down the dirt road, disappearing beyond the hill. The sound of hooves faded, leaving behind a hollow quiet broken only by the rustle of trees. For a long while, Elijah remained frozen in his chair. The house felt heavier without Samuel's presence, not emptier, but exposed. Every tick of the clock seemed to measure his guilt, and every creak in the floorboards carried an accusation. When Annabel passed through the doorway, Elijah finally spoke. He was poisoning them with lies. "You mean truth?" she asked. His head snapped toward her. "You think I lie?" "I think you confuse yourself," she said simply, then turned away, her voice trembling. "You talk of sin like you've never met your own." The words hit him harder than any sermon. For the first time in years, Elijah didn't have an answer. The truth, that he had spent decades baptizing his cruelty with Scripture, flickered in the back of his mind, a shadow he wanted to outrun. Outside, the plantation resumed its rhythm. The clang of bells, the crack of a whip, the distant hum of human labor. Elijah walked to the chapel near the edge of his property. The structure was small, whitewashed, perfect in its deception. Inside, dust danced in beams of sunlight. He kneeled before the altar, eyes closed, hands clasped. "Show me, Lord," he whispered. "Show me what they don't see. Prove that I am right." No answer came. He prayed harder, the words spilling faster, desperate now. "You chose me for this. You told me to guide them." But even as he said it, the memory surfaced, not of divine calling, but of his father. The man's booming voice, the lash in his hand, the Sunday lectures about strength and obedience. His father's words had been his gospel before any preachers had touched his ears. Elijah bowed his head lower, trembling. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. The air inside the chapel grew suffocating. When he opened his eyes, he realized he was talking not to God, but to his own reflection in the polished wood. Behind him, the door creaked open. Thomas Clay stepped inside, hat in hand. "Said you wanted to see me, Master Moore?" Elijah straightened slowly. "The men are restless," Clay continued. "Some of 'em been talking since that preacher left. We caught one skipping work this morning to pray." Elijah turned. "Pray?" "Aye, to the same Lord you do, only I reckon his prayer sounded freer." The comment landed like a strike. Elijah's jaw clenched. "Double their hours. They'll pray when their hands are too tired to lift." Clay hesitated. "With respect, sir, that might not scare him anymore." Elijah studied Clay's face, a man roughened by years of obedience, yet even his eyes showed the faintest shimmer of doubt. The infection was spreading, Elijah thought. Samuel's words had sown it deep. Hope. That was the most dangerous rebellion of all. He dismissed Clay with a wave, but his hands were shaking. That night, while the others slept, Elijah walked to the quarters again. Lantern in hand, he paused by the first cabin, listening. Inside, low voices murmured a hymn, unfamiliar, slow, full of mourning and defiance at once. He pressed his ear closer. The words were simple, but they carried a power that chilled him. Freedom as forgiveness, not rebellion. Mercy as fire. He bit down hard, inhaling through his nose. Devilry, he muttered. Yet his chest ached with something unnameable. He turned away and shouted for Clay, his voice echoing through the night. Bring me the man who started it. Moments later, two figures stumbled into the lantern's glow, one pushing the other forward. A young slave named Isaiah, barely 17, his wrists bound in rope. Elijah recognized him instantly, the boy who had always sung loudest in the fields. They say you've taken it upon yourself to preach beside your labor, Elijah said. Isaiah looked up, his eyes steady. Not preach, sir. Just praying like you taught. The stillness that followed was unbearable. Elijah's grip tightened around his lantern. You mock me. No, sir, Isaiah said quietly. But you said the Lord listens to every man. So I asked him why he don't hear us too. The words pierced through every layer Elijah had built. His throat tightened. You think he doesn't? I think he stopped listening to you, Isaiah replied, eyes shining with quiet resolve. For a heartbeat, Elijah could not move. Then the fury came rushing back, not just at the boy before him, but at everything he couldn't understand. He raised his hand, ready to strike, but froze midair when he felt something new. Fear. Fear that the boy was right, that all his prayers had been shadows cast against a wall that never spoke back. He turned abruptly, waving Clay off. Lock him up. No beatings tonight. He walked away, the storm of his thoughts louder than any scream. When he reached the porch, Annabelle was waiting, wrapped in her shawl. You heard him, didn't you? She asked. Elijah stopped, rain beginning to fall again, small and cold. He's been poisoned by that man's words. Her eyes softened. Maybe he's just found the truth you couldn't hold on to. He looked toward the fields, where mist began to rise from the damp soil. For the first time, Elijah Moore could not tell whether he was the master of anything at all, or just another man bound to his own sins. The next morning rose pale and tense, a thin mist veiling the horizon over the Moore plantation. The storm had washed away the footprints from the night before, but not the residue of unease. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Inside the house, Annabelle moved quietly through the halls, her face pale but determined. She had made up her mind. The moment Elijah left for the fields, she opened her drawer, pulled out paper and ink, and began to write. Each line was shaky but clear, a letter addressed to her brother in Savannah. She wrote of the cruelty she had borne witness to, of the blood disguised as prayer, of the man who once read the Bible with tenderness, but now wielded it like a blade. She did not ask for intervention. She asked only for escape. Her hands trembled as she sealed the letter, praying silently that the writer she'd paid in secret the day before would smuggle it out tonight. Outside, Elijah's voice carried across the land as he addressed his workers, the sermon disguised as a speech. The Lord sees obedience, he declared, pacing the edge of the field, and he rewards the faithful. You stray from righteousness. You stray from life itself. The men and women before him nodded, as they always did, their faces blank masks against years of fear. But one pair of eyes, Isaiah's, held his gaze, calm and unflinching. Elijah felt the defiance burn him like a brand. When he finished, Thomas Clay approached him, rubbing the back of his neck. Boy's been quiet all morning, but folks are watching him close. If he so much as breathes different, they'll follow. That's exactly why he'll stay locked tonight, Elijah said. He wants to speak to God. Let him do so in silence. Clay hesitated, unsure. Ain't right, sir. We ain't heard no rebellion, just some prayin' and star singin'. Maybe a few. Enough, Elijah snapped. The boy's spirit needs breaking before his voice infects the rest. Don't try to humanize disobedience. Clay said nothing, but the line of his jaw hardened. Somewhere deep in him, a fracture formed, small, invisible, but real. By noon, the heat clawed its way back. Elijah returned to the house, sweat soaking his collar, fury simmering under his calm. Annabelle met him at the door, offering water. You look tired, she said, her voice careful. He brushed past her. Men tire. Faith does not. She followed him into the parlor. Faith bends before it breaks, Elijah. That man yesterday, Samuel, he saw something you refused to. He turned sharply. And what's that? That you've stopped preaching to save souls. You preach now to silence them. Her words struck him like gunfire. He wanted to shout, to remind her of loyalty, of a wife's place. But something in her eyes stopped him. She was not pleading anymore. She was finished begging. Don't test me, he muttered, voice low. Don't mistake mercy for weakness. Annabelle stepped closer. No, Elijah. Mercy is the strength you've forgotten. Her courage disarmed him. For the first time, she walked away from him without waiting for permission. When the door shut behind her, he sank into the nearest chair, his pulse pounding. He poured bourbon into a glass, hands jerking with each splash. He told himself the drink would calm him, but it only sharpened the sounds outside, the faint singing drifting from the quarters again. It was the same song as the night before, the same haunting melody. This time, it wasn't just Isaiah. More voices joined, their harmony quiet but growing, faith turning bolder with each verse. Elijah stood, the veins in his neck tight. The song wasn't rebellion, but something worse, forgiveness. It forgave him without his permission, and he couldn't bear it. By dusk, he'd made his decision. Clay, he said, calling the overseer from the yard. Bring the boy to the chapel. The chapel? Clay asked, wary. You mean? Yes. Elijah's gaze fixed far beyond him. We'll see if the Lord still listens. When Isaiah was brought in, the light was fading fast through the high window. Dust hovered between the beams like ash. Elijah's Bible lay open on the pulpit, yet his hands trembled too hard to steady it. The boy's wrists were bound, but his chin was raised. Elijah Moore, Isaiah said softly. You think God's on your side. I know he is, Elijah said, though his voice cracked at the edges. And he'll forgive you if you ask. Isaiah shook his head. I already asked him. He forgive me long before this. Elijah's jaw clenched. Then why do you stand before me defiant? Because you ain't him, the boy answered. The words struck harder than a blow. For a long moment, neither spoke. Rain started to patter faintly against the roof. Elijah lifted the Bible, his voice shaking. The wages of sin. Ain't yours to charge, Isaiah interrupted quietly. You keep trying to pay in blood that ain't your own. Elijah's hand dropped. In the silence that followed, a strange calm settled in him, not peace, but surrender to confusion. The fire of conviction had gone out, replaced by the hollow chill of doubt. He lowered the Bible, staring at the boy's face. For the first time, he didn't see rebellion. He saw a reflection. Clay, he whispered, untie him. Clay blinked. Sir. I said untie him. The overseer hesitated, then obeyed, cutting the ropes. Isaiah rubbed his wrists, eyes wary. Elijah turned to the altar. Go back to your home, he said. Tell the others to pray, but quietly. Tonight, no songs. Isaiah nodded once, then stepped outside. Clay lingered in the doorway, uncertain whether to leave. When the door shut, Elijah stood alone in the chapel. The wind outside stirred the candles, shadows swaying along the walls. He sank to his knees, whispering, What do you want from me? His voice cracked. Have I not done all you asked? Have I not preached your word? No answer came, only the howl of wind and the creak of old boards beneath him. He felt like a man standing in a house built of every sermon he'd ever twisted, hearing the foundation groan beneath his lies. When he finally stumbled out into the yard, the night had vanished into utter blackness. The stars hid behind clouds, and thunder rumbled far to the south. Annabelle was waiting on the porch, her candle shaking in her hand. Where have you been? She whispered. In prayer, he said. She studied him, his soaked shirt, his trembling hands, the emptiness in his eyes. No, she murmured. You've been in war. He didn't respond. He just walked past her into the house. Upstairs, through the thin walls, he heard her cry softly. And from far across the field, another sound drifted, a single voice still singing, faint but unbroken. It wasn't Isaiah. It was a woman's voice, old and cracked, carrying a tune that seemed older than the land itself. For the first time, Elijah didn't rage against it. He simply sat in silence and listened. Every word felt like a confession he could never make aloud. The melody folded around him, slow and mournful, until the night swallowed even that. And in that silence, Elijah more realized that God had never stopped speaking. He had simply stopped wanting to listen. By sunrise, the plantation was unervingly quiet. The fields glistened in the pale light, their damp furrows gleaming like scars across the land. The storm had cooled the air, but not the tension. It lingered everywhere, heavy, invisible, pressing down like the breath of something unseen. Elijah Moore stood at the edge of his porch, coat slung over his shoulder, staring at the fields that had once filled him with pride. Today, they looked foreign, like land torn from God's favor. He hadn't slept again. His dreams were thick with whispers, the boy's defiant voice, the stranger's words, the sound of hymnals drifting through the rain. Every verse of comfort he'd leaned on his entire life now felt like a blade turned backwards. He poured coffee into a tin cup and took a long, bitter sip, eyes narrowing as the workers began to gather near the barn. Something in their movement felt different, less sluggish, more deliberate, as though they had agreed on something unspoken overnight. Thomas Clay rode up, hat tilted low. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice, words spreading fast. "Isaiah didn't speak, but the others think you freed him from punishment. They figure that means something." Elijah's jaw tightened. "It means nothing." Clay hesitated. "To them, it means hope." The word struck Elijah like a slap. Hope was dangerous. It breathed life into silence, turned obedience into challenge. He looked at the overseer sharply. "You'll remind them that the only thing they answer to is me." Clay nodded, but the doubt in his eyes betrayed him. "Yes, sir." Elijah turned toward the barn. Inside, the smell of hay mixed with iron and sweat. He watched them labor, men hauling equipment, women folding rough cloths, all too quiet. Isaiah worked among them, his shirt torn, back glistening under the weight of the sun, but his face wore no fear. When his eyes met Elijah's, he didn't flinch. There was sadness there, not hatred, something worse, something almost merciful. Annabelle appeared behind Elijah, her shawl drawn tight. "You can't live like this much longer," she said softly. He didn't turn. "Like what?" "Between one truth and another. You preach by morning and wrestle with demons by night. You're becoming a ghost inside your own house." Elijah exhaled, slow and uneven. "And what would you have me do? Abandon everything? Let this place burn in fate's name?" Her eyes filled with quiet resolve. Maybe letting it burn is the only honest sermon left. He stared at her, the words cutting deep. "You speak as though you've lost belief." "I haven't," she said. "But maybe I've stopped believing in you." Before he could reply, Clay called from the yard. "Sir, there's trouble by the well." Elijah turned swiftly, moving down the porch steps. A small crowd had formed, a broken bucket, a cracked rope, and one of the younger women kneeling beside a collapsed man. Elijah's boots sank in the mud as he approached. The man on the ground wheezed faintly, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. Isaiah was there too, trying to help him sit upright. Elijah's first instinct was anger. Why had they not asked permission? Why was order breaking already? But the man's face stopped him cold. It was Samuel Carter, the traveling preacher, caked in dirt and blood at the temple, his horse nowhere in sight. He looked half dead. "Dear God," Clay muttered. "What is he doing back here?" Samuel's eyes flickered open, small and weak. "The road washed out, storm took my horse. Thought the Lord had one more message for this place." Elijah knelt slowly, his knees sinking into the damp soil. "You should have stayed gone." Samuel's cracked lips formed a faint smile. Seems God disagreed. They carried him inside, laying him on the parlor couch. Annabelle hurried for towels and water while Elijah stood over the man, torn between outrage and something dangerously close to guilt. "You shouldn't be here," Elijah said again. "You opened wounds that never should have bled." Samuel coughed, weak but resolute. "They were bleeding long before I spoke." Annabelle dabbed his forehead. "He needs rest," she said. But Samuel's hand shot out, gripping Elijah's sleeve with frail but unrelenting force. You think you can preach your way out of cruelty. But the gospel you built, it's held together by fear, and fear don't save souls. Elijah's heart pounded. You know nothing of salvation. I know enough, Samuel rasped. You've mistaken control for grace. He coughed again, blood staining his tongue. Elijah turned away, not from disgust, but shame. For a long moment, only the clock ticked. Then, faintly, through the open window, a hymn rose again, soft, collective, patient. The voices outside were singing for the wounded man inside the house. Samuel smiled faintly. Hear that? They're praying for me, same ones you've been punishing for years. Maybe you should ask yourself why. Because I gave them his word. Elijah shouted. Samuel closed his eyes. No, you gave them your guilt and called it gospel. The silence that followed was deeper than any sermon. Samuel's breath slowed. He placed a hand on Elijah's wrist. Heaven ain't made for perfect men, Elijah. It's made for those who finally admit they aren't. Then his grip went slack. Annabelle gasped softly. He's gone. Elijah stood frozen. For the first time, the stillness inside the house felt sacred, not oppressive. The voices outside continued, stronger now, rising into the rafters, a chorus of mercy unshackled from fear. Annabelle knelt by the body, praying softly, while Elijah backed away toward the door. Outside, the sun was lowering again, gold spilling across the wet fields. The workers had stopped their labor, gathered near the porch, watching. Isaiah stood at the front, his expression unreadable but not hostile. Elijah stepped down slowly, his shadow cutting through the dust. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no strength. The preacher's gone, he finally murmured. Buried by the Lord's own hand, I reckon. No one moved. Then Isaiah stepped forward. May we say a prayer? Elijah hesitated, then nodded. The group knelt as one, heads bowed. Elijah remained standing, watching as their words rose into the twilight, simple, broken, beautiful. He realized then that their faith wasn't his to control. It never had been. It was the one thing on this soil that didn't belong to him. When the prayer ended, the group dispersed quietly. Elijah lingered until dusk turned to darkness. The cicadas returned. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, their glow soft against the gathering night. Annabelle came to stand beside him, wrapping her arm through his. You don't have to be what your father was, she whispered. He looked at her, the weight of his sins pressing harder than ever. And if I already am? Then start undoing what he built in you, she said. One truth at a time. That night, Elijah returned not to his bed, but to the chapel. He opened the doors wide, letting the cool air in. For the first time, he stood at the pulpit without his boots, without the cloak of superiority. His hands trembled over the pages, unsure what words might come. Then he closed the Bible entirely. His voice was low, almost fragile. If mercy be real, let it find me here. The wind shifted through the doorway, and for the briefest moment, he thought he heard a voice answer, not divine, but human, familiar, forgiving. Far out in the fields, the soil lay turned and open, waiting for morning. Elijah Moore, the man who had once ruled salvation through fear, bowed his head to the earth and whispered, Forgive me for what I made of your word. Morning broke with a cold wind out of the north, carrying the smell of wet pine and ash. It swept through the plantation, rattling shutters and bending the brittle crops that had survived the storms. Elijah Moore woke on the chapel floor, his back sore from the wooden planks, his clothes still damp with the night's humidity. He had prayed until exhaustion claimed him, though whether prayer or punishment kept him there, he could not tell. A rooster crowed somewhere in the distance. His eyes fluttered open to pale light spilling across the open doorway. For a brief moment he felt disoriented, as if time had skipped forward, as if he'd slept through months instead of hours. The chapel felt emptier, lighter somehow, as if every ghost he'd conjured through the years had slipped out during the night. Annabelle found him still kneeling by the pew. She didn't speak. She simply placed a folded blanket at his side, her movements gentle yet deliberate. He looked up at her, his voice hoarse. I've lost everything, haven't I? She studied him. Not everything. You still have breath. That's more mercy than most receive. Elijah nodded faintly. He rubbed his hands together, staring at his calloused palms. Once he believed those hands were righteous, hands that punished for the sake of order, hands that fed because ownership demanded care. But now even his skin felt foreign, like it belonged to a stranger who'd wandered too far down the wrong road. I thought I was saving them, he whispered. All this time, I thought I was saving souls. Annabelle's gaze softened. You can't save anyone if you can't see them as human first. There was no anger in her tone, only sorrow, the kind that comes after years of holding one's breath. She turned and stepped away, her figure framed by the morning sun, her white dress fluttering in the breeze like a fragile flag of peace. Elijah watched her go, realizing that she was freer than he would ever be, even bound to the same land. Outside, the plantation had begun to stir. Clay was barking orders, his voice sharp though thinner now, stripped of its former confidence. The workers moved slower than before, not from laziness, but from awareness. They knew something had shifted in their master, and in their overseer too. The rhythm of the farm was breaking like a song, losing its careful tempo. Elijah stepped out from the chapel, the cool air biting his lungs. Clay noticed and dismounted his horse. Morning, sir. We've got folks refusing orders now. Elijah's brows knit. Refusing. Not working the fields, not taking food from the kitchen, till Isaiah's back. They claim he's gone preaching by the creek, and none of them will lift a hand until you let him. Elijah exhaled slowly, feeling a ripple of unease. And what would you have me do, Thomas? Clay met his eyes, the first trace of defiance flickering beneath years of obedience. Maybe let him be. Maybe the land can do without one day's labor. Elijah stared at him. You've turned soft. Maybe, Clay said quietly. Or maybe I've started listening to the prayers I've been ignoring. The answer struck Elijah like truth often does, quiet but piercing. He said nothing more and walked down the dirt path toward the creek. The morning mist clung to the trees, draping them in gray. He could hear the faint trickle of water, and then voices. Not loud, not rebellious, but unified. Prayer. Hymn. He stepped through the trees and saw them. Dozens gathered under the wide stretch of pecan branches, shoes off, eyes closed, hands joined. In the center stood Isaiah, his back straight, his words low and sure. We pray for the ones who lost their way, the boy said softly, and for the ones who think they can't be found. The crowd murmured amen. Elijah froze at the edge of the clearing, unseen. For minutes he just watched, struck by the peace etched into their faces. There was no fear there, none of the trembling obedience he had cultivated through years of sermons and punishment. What he saw was something he'd never been able to create, true faith. Even stripped of everything, they prayed for him. Master, a voice said behind him. It was Clay, stepping carefully through the brush. You gonna stop this? Elijah shook his head slowly. No. They finally learned how to speak to God without me. Clay frowned, surprised. And what now? Elijah didn't answer immediately. He took off his hat, pressing it against his chest. Now I reckon I ask for forgiveness the only way left, through work. He turned and walked past Clay, back toward the house. By noon, the plantation crew saw something they had never seen before. Elijah Moore walking the fields with sleeves rolled, hands in the dirt beside his workers. No sermons, no commands. Just silence and labor. Those who watched didn't cheer, they didn't trust it yet, but something in the air shifted nonetheless. The man who had ruled their every breath was sweating beside them, and his silence carried more meaning than any verse he had ever spoken. Annabelle saw him from a porch, her face unreadable. When the sun dipped low, she came to him with a jug of water. He took it, drinking gratefully, his throat dry. The letter I sent, she said quietly. My brother will get it soon. I'm leaving when he comes for me. Elijah nodded, too tired to plead. I know. You could leave too, she said. He looked at her with eyes that had carved too much grief into themselves. And go where? The ground here knows my sins. If I leave, I'll just carry them somewhere else. She studied him for a long time, then said softly, "Then bury them here." As the final rays of sun melted against the horizon, Elijah did just that. He walked to the old oak where he'd once delivered his cruelest sermons. The lightning strike years ago had split the trunk in two, blackened and ragged. He knelt by its roots and began digging with his bare hands, scraping at the earth until his fingers bled. Into that shallow grave he placed his Bible, the one that had witnessed every lie he'd told himself, and covered it with dirt. "I don't know what's left of me without you," he whispered to the soil, "but maybe that's the point." Behind him, Isaiah approached quietly. "They say you're changin'," the boy said, voice cautious. "That true?" Elijah looked up at him. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just starting to see." Isaiah nodded slowly. "Then maybe we can both pray for that." They stood together as dusk deepened around the trees. The first stars began to flicker alive. For the first time in his life, Elijah didn't feel the urge to speak over someone's prayer. He simply closed his eyes and let the boy's voice weave through the rustling leaves, rising like smoke into the darkening sky. When they finished, Elijah looked toward the horizon. The plantation stretched before him, not as his dominion anymore, but as a place still capable of forgiveness. Tomorrow, he thought, he would wake before dawn and work again, not as master, not as savior, but as a man trying to remember what mercy feels like. For now, though, he just listened to the wind, to the quiet, to the unspoken understanding that somewhere in this broken place, redemption had begun to take root. The days that followed blurred into one long stretch of sun, sweat, and silence. Elijah Moore rose with the dawn and worked alongside the others, his back stooped, his hands blistered. At first the workers avoided him, keeping distance, refusing to meet his eyes. But little by little, the rhythm of shared labor began to close the space between them. The man who had once spoken like thunder now barely murmured, and in that stillness, something fragile began to grow. The plantation no longer echoed with the crack of the whip. Clay had stopped carrying one at all, a quiet rebellion that Elijah didn't challenge. The men worked in ordered rows, the soft scrape of hose and the hum of song replacing what had once been fear. At first, those songs were shy, unsure if they'd be punished for sound. When punishment never came, they swelled, low, rich harmonies that rolled through the fields like waves. Elijah listened every day, each note pressing against the edges of his guilt. One afternoon, Annabelle came down to the fields, her skirt brushing the stalks. She carried a small basket of cornbread and water, setting it by the shade of the oak. Her movements were quieter now, but her eyes no longer avoided him. "You've stopped shouting," she said gently, watching as Elijah straightened, dirt streaking his arms. "Maybe shouting never made anyone hear me," he said. "Maybe it just made them silent." Annabelle looked past him toward the workers. "They say you freed Isaiah from the house debt yesterday. Is that true?" "It's true," Elijah said. "He wanted the deed for his mother's cabin. Said it was time they owned something God placed their hands on." She tilted her head. "You're giving away what your father built." Elijah nodded, eyes distant. "Then maybe I'm finally dismantling what he left rotting in me." For a moment, neither spoke. The cicadas droned in the trees, thick in the heat. Annabelle watched him return to the rows, each motion deliberate, steady. There was no glory left in his work, only necessity. When she turned back to the house, something like love flickered in her chest, a faint ember too fragile to name. That night, as the others slept, Elijah returned to the chapel. The doors creaked when he opened them, as though the building itself wasn't sure it recognized him anymore. He lit a single candle on the altar. Its flames swayed with the night breeze, painting gold light across the bare walls. The Bible he had buried was gone from its usual place. All that remained was a rusted cross leaning by the window. "You still in there?" he whispered. "You watching?" The silence that followed was deep, but not empty. He felt it stretch through him, no longer judgmental, just present. When dawn arrived, he found Isaiah waiting by the well. "They're leaving," the boy said. "The first group. Families bound north." Elijah's stomach twisted. "Leaving the plantation?" "Them that want to," Isaiah said. "You gave us the freedom, didn't you? Now we take it. Elijah hadn't spoken the word freedom himself, but he realized the land had. It had carried the message long before his tongue could, through gestures, through absence, through the simple act of him not stopping them. "And you?" he asked. Isaiah shrugged, sunlight glinting against the small cross on his chest. "Maybe I'll stay till the harvest. Maybe this place deserves one last growing season before we let it rest." Elijah nodded faintly. "You lead them by faith. Don't let it turn into pride. That's where I lost the Lord." Isaiah smiled sadly. "Maybe you didn't lose him, sir. Maybe you just never learned how to share." The words lingered long after the boy walked away. By midday, the first wagons rolled down the old road. Families who had known nothing but captivity carried bundles of clothes, a few tools, and the weight of generations on their shoulders. Elijah stood on the porch with Annabel, watching them disappear one by one into the shimmering distance. He did not call out. He did not bless them aloud. He only bowed his head, as if receiving their forgiveness in silence. The house felt hollow after they left. Empty rooms echoed with memory, the sound of chains, of footsteps, of prayers he had ignored. Annabel took to sitting near the window in the evenings, sewing quietly, her eyes drifting toward the horizon. "My brother's wagon will come soon," she said one night. "There's room for you if you wish it." Elijah shook his head. "This land's got one more thing to say to me. After that, I'll know whether I deserve to leave it." The following morning brought a shock of cold wind, strange for Georgia in early fall. Dark clouds gathered low, dragging shadows across the cotton fields. Clay approached him by the barn, his expression uneasy. "You sure about this, sir?" he asked. "Letting them go's one thing. Giving the place away's another." Elijah met his eyes. "Ownership broke me, Thomas. Maybe letting go will save what's left." He handed Clay a folded paper, the deed. "Split this among those who remain. Burn the rest." Clay looked at him as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps he was. "What about you?" Elijah smiled faintly. "Me? I'll still be here. Only this time, I'll answer to every sunrise I used to command." That afternoon, thunder rolled again, echoing off the hills. The storm gathered like a reckoning but never broke, lingering above the land. Elijah walked out to the oak, now hollowed and blackened at its heart. He pressed his hand against the charred trunk, feeling its roughness beneath his palm. "You've seen everything," he whispered. "All my lies, all my prayers." Something loosened in him then, not an epiphany, not sudden grace, but a quiet release. He looked down at the soil, still alive with green shoots from the rain. "You'll grow again," he murmured, kneeling. "Not for me. For them." He stayed there for a long while, tracing the dirt lines between his fingers. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, he felt warmth again, light brushing the back of his neck. A hawk glided overhead, dipping low across the fields before vanishing toward the trees. That evening, Annabel came to find him still sitting by the oak. "It's time," she said softly. "The carriage is here." He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just his wife, but a woman who had survived him, endured him, and somehow kept a piece of her grace intact. "You should go," he said. "The world waits for you beyond this." "You could still come," she whispered. Elijah shook his head. "There's something about staying that feels right." Annabel lingered a moment longer, tears shining unshed, then turned toward the road. He watched her figure fade into the distance, swallowed by dust and twilight. When she was gone, the silence returned, but it was different now, lighter, as though the land itself was exhaling after years of holding its breath. By nightfall, the last of the fireflies flickered over the fields, lighting the dark like scattered prayers. Elijah sat with them until the insects burnt themselves out against the damp air. Finally, he whispered into the night, "Let the ashes feed the next season." Behind him, the old house creaked under the weight of years, its windows glowing faintly with the reflection of the stars. He closed his eyes, inhaled the scent of soil and pine, and let the wind carry the rest, the guilt, the sermons, the false holiness, away. Somewhere in that endless field, bare and open under a forgiving sky, a single seed shifted in the dirt, unnoticed, but alive, waiting for the next morning to come. By the time autumn settled over the hills of Georgia, the plantation no longer resembled what it once had been. The fields were quieter now, dotted not with lines of laborers, but wild grass, patches of new growth reclaiming the earth that had been beaten down for decades. The fences sagged in places, the white paint peeling in strips beneath the chill wind. Nature was taking its slow revenge, or perhaps its slow healing. Elijah Moore remained there, alone, weathered, and changed in ways he could neither name nor explain. It had been nearly 2 months since Annabelle's departure. He remembered her words every evening when the sky turned honey-colored and the first frogs began to croak near the creek. "Then bury them here," she had said. Bury the sins. Each night he walked the property, surveying the silence like an old minister wandering through a desecrated church. Only this church was alive again, breathing, no longer echoing with cruelty. He had stopped wearing the stiff collars and dark coats of the preacher. His hair, once meticulously trimmed, now hung loose, brushed gray at the edges. When he looked at his reflection in the pond at dawn, he scarcely recognized the man staring back. That man's eyes were gentler, still sad, but softer than before. He was no longer the master who spoke in commandments. He was merely Elijah. Sometimes in the evenings, Isaiah would return from the north. The boy, now grown fast and sure, rode bareback across the fields, bringing news of others who had settled near Savannah, some who had found work, some who had simply vanished into free soil. Each visit reminded Elijah of what he had once destroyed and what little he could now restore. "They built a church out there," Isaiah said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. "A place where nobody owns the pulpit. Everyone can speak." Elijah smiled faintly at the thought. "Then maybe they've done what I never could." Isaiah studied the old man for a long moment before speaking again. "They still talk about you. Not all kindly. But some say you changed." "Maybe," Elijah said. "Change don't clean the blood, but it lets you stop bleeding." The boy nodded, his expression solemn. "You gonna come visit? You could see what freedom looks like when it's got room to breathe." Elijah looked toward the horizon. "I will, but not yet. This ground still talks to me when the wind blows." Isaiah smiled, understanding more than Elijah expected. "You listen good, then." He tipped his hat and turned his horse toward the road, his figure shrinking against the golden dusk. That night, Elijah sat on the porch with a lantern beside his knee, scribbling in a worn journal that Annabelle had left behind. The pages smelled faintly of her perfume. He wrote not scripture, but truth in the only way he could, confession. He wrote of his father's cruelty, of the sermons disguised as violence, of how faith turned monstrous in the hands of pride. Each line loosened something in him, like the careful prying of boards long nailed shut. By the second week of October, a letter arrived, Annabelle's handwriting, neat and graceful, the ink faintly smudged in places. She wrote from Savannah. "The Lord works strangely, Elijah. I do not know whether I love you out of pity or faith, but I do know this: you are not beyond grace. The fields you walked in ruin may bloom again someday. Whether you see it or not depends on what you let die inside yourself." He folded the letter carefully, set it on the table, and stared out the window into the fading light. He could almost hear her voice through the wind, steady and unresentful. The following morning, he decided to ring the chapel bell for the first time in months. The rope felt rough in his hands, the bell heavy with rust. As it swung, the sound rolled out across the plantation, a hollow, resonant clang that startled birds from the trees. It wasn't a call to prayer, nor a demand for obedience. It was a sound of remembrance, of reckoning. When the echoes faded, a strange quiet followed, richer than ever before. That same day, he made his way down to the grave of Samuel Carter, the preacher who had died on his couch months earlier. The ground had settled unevenly, covered in brittle weeds. Elijah knelt there, brushing the dirt away with one hand. "You were right," he murmured. "You said I'd kneel for mercy. I thought you meant in fear. Turns out it feels a lot more like peace." The breeze rustled through the trees, carrying leaves across the grave. Elijah stayed there a long while, eyes closed, the warmth of the sun pressing faintly against the back of his neck. When he rose again, he walked further into the woods, following the creek where Isaiah's congregation had once gathered. The water shimmered silver against the stones, clearer than he remembered. At the water's edge, he rolled up his sleeves and waded in. The cold made him gasp, but he didn't step back. He bent down, scooping handfuls of water to his face, washing away dirt and sweat. Not baptism, he muttered to himself. Just beginning again. Behind him, the sound of hooves startled the birds. It was Clay, older and slower now, his clothes patched with dirt and age. "Thought I'd find you here," the overseer said, dismounting stiffly. Most men would have left by now, sold this ghost land and gone chasing comfort. Elijah chuckled softly. "Comfort's what got me into ruin." Clay looked at him carefully. "You really mean to keep working this place?" "Not working," Elijah said. "Maybe just listening. There's things here that might still forgive me." "Forgive?" Clay scoffed. "Ain't nobody left to forgive." Elijah turned toward him, eyes clear for the first time in years. "Then I'll forgive the ones who can't. That's where the work begins." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Clay reached into his coat, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Found this near the old garden patch. Thought you might want it." Inside was Elijah's buried Bible, mud-stained but intact. The pages were swollen, edges warped by rain, yet when Elijah flipped it open, one verse still stood legible in the dim light. "Mercy triumphs over judgment." He felt his throat tighten. "Keep it," he said. "I've got my own words now." Clay nodded slowly. "Then maybe the Lord finally trusts you to speak for yourself." As evening fell, Elijah returned to the house. The porch light flickered low, and the sound of crickets rose from the woods. He set his lantern beside the door, staring up at the sky. Stars shone sharp and bright, unclouded for the first time in what felt like years. Everything around him smelled of earth and renewal. He walked out into the fields one last time that night, the soil soft under his boots. The rows were untended, but wildflowers had begun to bloom at the edges, yellow bursts of life amid the ruins of cotton. He knelt, pressed his palm flat against the ground, and whispered, "This time you'll grow free." The wind answered, cool and certain, rippling through the tall stalks. Somewhere far behind him, the chapel bell swayed once more, giving a final single note that faded into the dark. When the sound vanished, Elijah Moore stood alone beneath an open sky, neither master nor preacher, nothing but a man learning, at last, how to live without power, and how to forgive what power had made of him.
Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.